I want to tell you about the only time in 40 years of practice that I almost stood up from my chair during a session. Not out of anger, out of sheer disbelief. Because a man walked into my office for couples therapy with his wife, and the woman he brought with him was not his wife. His wife was already sitting in the waiting room, and what happened over the next 90 minutes is something I still have trouble believing, even though I watched every second of it unfold 3 feet in front of me. The couple, I will call them Martin and Claire, had been seeing me for about 6 weeks. Martin was 44, a real estate developer, the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately starts managing it. He had a firm handshake, a loud voice, and a habit of answering questions that were directed at Claire. Claire was 41, a former teacher who had stopped working when their second child was born. She was quiet in sessions, but not passive. There is a difference. Passive people have given up. Quiet people are choosing when to speak. Claire was choosing. They came to me because Claire had found text messages on Martin's phone. Not explicit ones, but intimate ones. The kind of messages that do not leave room for misinterpretation. Pet names. Inside jokes. A photograph of 2 glasses of wine on a balcony that Claire had never been to. Martin's explanation was that the messages were from a colleague and that Claire was reading too much into them. He used the word paranoid twice in our first session. I made a note of that. People who use clinical language to describe their spouse's reasonable suspicion are almost always hiding something. Claire did not argue with him. She just looked at me and said, "I know what I saw, Dr. Whitfield. I am not here to be convinced I am wrong. I am here to find out what happens next." I liked Claire. I try not to take sides in couples therapy, and I rarely do, but I can acknowledge when one person in the room is being more honest than the other. Claire was being honest. Martin was performing. He was performing the role of the wrongly accused husband, and he was doing it with the confidence of someone who had never been caught at anything in his life. Over the first 6 weeks, we made what I would describe as superficial progress. Martin agreed to be more transparent with his phone. Claire agreed to work on what Martin called her trust issues, a phrase I gently reframed as her need for reassurance, because language matters in my line of work. They did the exercises, they had the conversations. Martin brought flowers to one session and presented them to Claire like a man depositing evidence of his innocence. I want to be clear about something. I did not know at that point whether Martin was actually having an affair. I suspected it. The patterns were there. But suspicion is not knowledge, and my job is not to be a detective. My job is to create a space where truth can emerge on its own. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not. And sometimes, in very rare cases, the truth walks through the door wearing heels and perfume, and sits down on your therapy couch like it owns the place. That is what happened on a Tuesday in November. I had a session scheduled with Martin and Claire at 4 in the afternoon. Claire arrived first, as she always did. She was punctual in a way that suggested she took the process seriously. She sat in the waiting room with her coat folded neatly on her lap and nodded to me when I opened the door to check if they had both arrived. She said Martin was parking the car. A few minutes later, I heard the outer door open and 2 sets of footsteps in the hallway. Martin appeared in the doorway of the waiting room with a woman beside him. She was tall, dark-haired, perhaps 35. Wearing a tailored coat and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than my office furniture. She was attractive in the way that certain women are attractive, not just physically, but atmospherically. She carried herself like someone accustomed to being looked at. Martin introduced her as Renata. He said she was his business partner and that he had asked her to join the session so that Claire could hear directly from her that there was nothing romantic between them. He said it the way a lawyer presents an exhibit. Calm, rehearsed, logical. I looked at Claire. Her face did not change. Not one muscle moved. She looked at Renata, then at Martin, then at me. And in that look I saw something I had seen in Claire before, but had not fully understood until that moment. I saw a woman who was not surprised. She was furious, but she was not surprised. There is an important distinction there. Surprise means you did not see it coming. Claire saw it coming. She just did not know what form it would take. I had a decision to make, and I had about 3 seconds to make it, This was not a standard therapeutic situation. Martin had brought an uninvited third party into a couple session without consulting me, without discussing it with Claire in advance, and without any clinical justification. In 30 years of practice up to that point, no one had ever done anything like this. I could have asked Renata to leave. That would have been the textbook move. Protect the therapeutic space, maintain boundaries, remove the disruption. But I did not, and I will tell you why. Because Claire did not ask me to. She looked at me and gave the smallest nod I have ever seen. Barely a movement, just a slight dip of the chin. And I understood what she was telling me. She was saying, "Let this happen. Let him do this. Let me see exactly who he is." So I let it happen. I invited everyone into my office. Martin sat in his usual chair. Claire sat in hers. Renata sat on the small sofa against the wall that I normally reserved for individual clients. She crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap and smiled at me with perfect composure. I remember thinking that she was either genuinely innocent or extraordinarily well prepared. I would find out which one within the hour. Martin took control immediately, as he always did. He explained that he wanted Renata to tell Claire about the nature of their working relationship. He said they had been business partners for 3 years. They co-developed commercial properties. They traveled together occasionally for site visits and investor meetings. He said that every interaction between them had been professional, and that Claire's suspicions were based on a misunderstanding of how modern business partnerships work. Renata confirmed everything Martin said. She was articulate, measured, and sympathetic toward Claire. She said she understood how the messages might have looked out of context. She said she had no romantic interest in Martin whatsoever. She said she was in a happy relationship of her own and would never interfere in someone else's marriage. She looked at Claire when she said this, with an expression of sincere concern that was almost convincing. Almost. I watched Claire during all of this. She sat perfectly still with her hands in her lap. She did not interrupt. She did not cry. She did not fidget. She listened the way a person listens when they already know the ending of the story, but want to hear how the other person tells it. When Renata finished, I asked Claire if she had any questions. Claire said yes, she had one. She opened her handbag, the one she always clutched on her lap like a shield, and she pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printout. She unfolded it slowly, smoothed it on her knee, and read from it without looking up. She read a text message. It was from Martin's phone, sent to Renata's number at 2:17 in the morning, on a date 4 months prior. I would not repeat the exact contents because they were graphic, but I will tell you that the message described in detail a physical encounter that had taken place that evening and expressed anticipation for the next one. It was not ambiguous. It was not professional. It was the kind of message that leaves no room for interpretation, no space for the word colleague to occupy. The room went silent. I mean genuinely silent. The kind of silence that has weight to it. Martin's face drained of color. I watched it happen in real time, the blood leaving his cheeks, his jaw going slack, his eyes moving from Claire to Renata and back again, like a man trying to calculate an escape route from a building that is already on fire. Renata did not move. She sat perfectly still on the sofa with her hands still folded and her legs still crossed. But her composure shifted. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a slight press of the lips. She was not shocked by what Claire had read. She was shocked that Claire had it. Claire looked up from the paper. She looked at Renata and said very quietly, "You said you were in a happy relationship of your own. Is your partner aware that you send messages like this to married men at 2 in the morning?" Renata said nothing. Claire folded the paper and put it back in her handbag. Then she turned to Martin and said, "I came to therapy because I wanted to believe I was wrong about you. I wanted you to prove me wrong. Instead, you brought your mistress into our therapist's office and asked her to lie to my face. And you thought that would work. That is what hurts the most, Martin. Not the affair. The fact that you thought I was stupid enough to believe this." Martin started to speak. He said Claire's name. He said, "Listen to me." Claire held up one hand and said, "I am done listening. I have been listening for 12 years. I have listened to every excuse, every explanation, every version of events that made me the problem. I am finished." She stood up. She picked up her coat. She looked at me and said, "Thank you, Dr. Whitfield. This was the most productive session we have ever had." And then she walked out. Martin sat in his chair for a long time after that. Renata left quickly and quietly, without saying goodbye to either of us. I heard her heels clicking down the hallway and the outer door closing behind her. Martin and I were alone. He put his head in his hands. He did not cry. He sat there breathing. After a while he looked at me and said, "I really thought that would work. I really thought if Claire heard it from Renata, she would believe it." I asked him what made him think that. He said, "Because Claire always believes me. She always has." That sentence has stayed with me for decades, because it reveals something fundamental about how certain people think about trust. Martin did not see Claire's trust as something precious that he was violating. He saw it as a resource he was using, a tool, something reliable and renewable that would always be there no matter how many times he drew from it. He had been drawing from that well for 12 years, and it had never run dry, so he assumed it never would. He brought his mistress to therapy not because he was clever, but because he genuinely could not imagine a world in which Claire would stop believing him. But Claire had stopped. Quietly, privately, in her own time, she had crossed a threshold that Martin did not know existed. She had done her own research. She had obtained the evidence she needed, and she had come to that session not as a wife hoping to be proved wrong, but as a woman preparing to leave. Martin's stunt with Renata did not change Claire's mind. Claire's mind was already made up. All Martin did was give her the final confirmation she needed, and he did it in front of a witness. I saw Martin once more after that session. He came alone the following week and asked me if there was anything he could do to save the marriage. I told him honestly that the therapeutic relationship between us was compromised, that I had witnessed something in that room that made it impossible for me to serve as a neutral party going forward, and that I would be happy to refer him to a colleague. He nodded. He shook my hand. He left. I learned later through a referral network that Claire filed for divorce within the month. The proceedings were not amicable, but they were efficient. Claire had prepared well. She had more than just the one text message. She had months of documentation, phone records, hotel receipts, a timeline that her attorney presented with the precision of a prosecution case. Martin's attorney negotiated. Claire's attorney did not negotiate. There was not much to negotiate over. The evidence was overwhelming and Martin's credibility was destroyed, in part because his own therapist would have been called to testify about the session where he brought his mistress into the room and asked her to deny the affair in front of his wife. That is a detail people do not often consider. When you behave a certain way in front of a licensed professional, you are creating a record. I would never have volunteered that information. Confidentiality is the foundation of what I do. But if subpoenaed, I would have had to tell the truth. Martin never thought about that. He never thought about any of it. He was so convinced of his own ability to control every room he walked into, that he walked into the one room where control was impossible, and tried to do it anyway. Claire sent me a card about a year later. It was brief. She thanked me for not asking Renata to leave the room that day. She said that moment, watching Martin and Renata perform their rehearsed denial while she sat there holding the proof in her handbag, was the moment she finally felt free. Not angry, not sad. Free. She said it was like watching a magic trick after someone has shown you how it works. You see the same movements, but the illusion is gone. I think about Martin and Claire when I think about the role of arrogance in the destruction of marriages. Most affairs end because of carelessness. A text left open, a charge on a credit card, a friend who talks. But Martin's affair did not end because of carelessness. It ended because of hubris. He was so confident in his ability to deceive Claire that he escalated the deception to an absurd degree. He brought the other woman into the room and asked her to lie. He thought he was being bold. He was being blind. And Claire. I think about Claire's patience, not the patience of someone who is passive or defeated, but the patience of someone who is building a case. She came to therapy every week. She sat in that chair. She listened to Martin's excuses. She watched his body language. She studied him the way you study a problem you intend to solve. And when the moment came, she was ready. One sheet of paper, one text message, one question directed at the other woman with surgical precision. In my experience, the people who survive betrayal best are not the ones who react the fastest. They are the ones who react at the right time. Claire chose her moment, and her moment was devastating. If you are still here, if this story made you think about the people in your own life and the lies you have believed, or the ones you have told, then you understand why I keep telling these stories. Not because they are entertaining, although some of them are, in a grim sort of way, but because they are true. Not literally, the names are changed, the details are altered, but the patterns are true. I have seen these patterns repeat themselves hundreds of times across 4 decades. The arrogant husband, the underestimated wife, the moment of reckoning that could have been avoided if one person had simply told the truth. I have more of these. If you want to hear them, subscribe. I'm an old man with a lot of stories and not much else to do with my evenings. Stay for a while. I will tell you what I know.